extraordinary event in 1967 made the small fishing village of Shag Harbor famous. This small town in the southern part of Nova Scotia would be the site of one of the best-known UFO events in the last 57 years. And what makes this case special is that it is the only UFO story that I have come across without a critic. Everyone involved in this story is a believer, even the critics. And when you watch this video, chances are that you would be one too. On the night of October 4th, 1967, people were going about their normal lives when they saw a couple of strange orange lights in the sky. The strange lights were in the air, moving rapidly. Then it moved to a harbor, hovering over the body of water. The next thing that was heard was a big splash as it crashed into the water. These 4 orange lights were seen that night by a couple of teenagers who even swore they saw the orange lights flash in sequence before suddenly diving at a 45-degree angle toward the water's surface all at once. Multiple people from different locations witnessed this event, and that is what makes this story captivating and somewhat true. The first witness statement I got was from a pilot who saw the lights up close in the sky. At 7:15 p.m., Air Canada First Officer Robert Ralph told Captain Pierre Charbonneau that there was something strange on the left side of Flight 305 as it flew over Sherbrooke and Saint-Jean, Quebec at 12,001 feet. At the time, the flight was leaving Halifax International Airport and going to Toronto. The captain wrote in his report that he saw something a few miles away moving along a parallel path. According to him, he saw what looked like a bright oblong object with a line of smaller lights going around it, but he couldn't tell what it was. By 7:19 p.m., the pilots saw and heard a loud blast close to the big object. After 2 minutes, there was a second blast that turned into a blue cloud around the object, and that was the last time they saw it. In Mahone Bay, Daryl Dorey, his sister Annette, and his mother were sitting on their front porch when they saw a big object moving above the southwest sky, but they couldn't tell exactly what it was. He even had to ask the RCAF Greenwood Base commander in a letter the next day what was flying in the sky that night, because he had never seen anything like it. Then another credible witness statement came from a Captain Leo Howard Mercy. As Captain Leo Howard Mercy stood in the wheelhouse of his ship, he looked at 4 motionless blips on his Decca radar. He could see the 4 bright objects in a roughly rectangular shape when he looked up from his ship's windows, which were about 28 kilometers away. Captain Leo wasn't alone when he witnessed this event. There were also 20-plus fishermen on board who stood on the deck and watched the object in the northeastern sky. Captain Leo then radioed the Rescue Coordination Center and the harbor master in Halifax to ask what was going on, hoping someone could explain what everyone was seeing. But the people on the other line didn't understand what he was talking about. When they got back to port, he told the Lunenburg RCMP about what he saw, and ended up giving a report about it. At first, and why I love this story, is that people didn't go UFO at first glance. Everyone tried to understand what they were seeing, and then, when it went to the water, they thought maybe it was a plane that lost control and crashed. So everyone at different venues at different times was calling the police to come help. At first, the police got a call from the group of teenagers who had seen it earlier, but the police chief thought it was a prank after the teenagers described what they saw. In such, he asked the kids if they had been drinking, but they replied no. The police chief got another call and ended the call with the teenagers instantly, still thinking it was a prank call. And just like the kids, this woman also called to report a crash at Shag Harbor. And then the calls kept coming in. Now the police knew something was definitely up, and they quickly dispatched some officers to the scene. 3 RCMP officers quickly got to the scene in 15 minutes. In such, Ron Pound, one of the police officers sent to the scene, had already seen the weird lights while driving to Shag Harbor on Highway 3. Ron thought he saw 4 lights that were all connected to the same drone, and approximated the drone or craft to be about 60 feet long. Officer Ron went to the shore to get a better look at the phenomenal sight. Police Corporal Victor Werbicki, Constable Ron O'Brien, and other people from the area were with him. Remember, most people thought it was a plane crash, so the RCMP station called the Rescue Coordination Center, RCC, in Halifax to let them know what was going on and to find out if any planes were missing. When the policemen finally got to the shore, instead of seeing fire and debris, they saw a smooth yellow light moving slowly on the water, leaving a trail of yellow foam behind it. Everyone looked at the light as it slowly moved far away, as they were trying to understand what they were seeing, until the light couldn't be seen anymore in the deep, cold water. Whatever this flying object was, it was clear that it was too late to save it as it sank below. A rescue plan was put together quickly, and in less than 30 minutes after the crash, fishing boats from the area went out to the Gulf of Maine off Shag Harbor to look for survivors. 2 groups of fishermen and a Canadian Coast Guard search and rescue cutter, that is Coast Guard Cutter 101, came about an hour later nearby Clark's Harbor to assist in the search to either recover this plane or at least save someone. Despite hours of extensive searches, neither group was able to find any survivors, bodies, or wreckage. Instead, they were confronted with the strange sight of a thick, yellowish cluster of foam bubbles that was approximately 80 feet wide and half a mile long. On top of that, the air had a strangely sulfurous odor that no one knew where it came from, like the smell of a sofa burning. A lot of the local fishermen who saw the foam were sure it wasn't normal tidal foam. Besides being familiar with the local weather conditions in the area, there were a few things that made it stand out, like the sparkle, the way it dissipated, the sheer amount of it, and its density all pointed to something very strange. After much searching, nothing could be found that night, and the search was officially called off at 3 a.m. But here is where things start to get weird again. Despite being sure that what they saw was a plane, by the next morning, RCC Halifax had found that there were no lost planes. The captain of the Canadian Coast Guard cutter got a radio word from RCC Halifax saying that all civilian, military, and commercial planes along the eastern seaboard in both the Atlantic provinces and New England were all accounted for and safe. On the same morning, RCC Halifax also sent a priority telex to the air desk at Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa. Sounds normal until you find out that this air desk was in charge of all citizen and military UFO sightings. Just like how the US has its own division that is in charge of UFO sightings, this was the Canadian division. The telex told them about the crash and said that all normal explanations, like planes, flares, etc., had all been ruled out. This is when it was first tagged as a UFO report. The head of the air desk then sent another important telex to the Navy offices about the UFO report it got from RCC Halifax and asked that a search be done underwater. After that, the Navy sent another urgent telex telling the Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic to conduct a search underwater. Things were now heating up. 2 days after the event was reported, a group of military divers from Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic was put together, and for the next 3 days, they searched the Gulf of Maine seafloor off Shag Harbor for the object or signs of it. But in the end, nothing was found. Not even a scrap metal or chipped off paint job was seen. If not that hundreds of people from different locations, both air, land, and sea, saw these lights, you would have thought anyone telling this story was crazy or a UFO nut job. This was a report about the search effort. Of course, by now, the media was having a frenzy with the whole event. Even a comic book was made about the event. The search got a lot of attention from the local media, especially the Halifax Chronicle-Herald. The newspaper ran an in-depth story on October 7th with the intriguing title, "Could Be Something Concrete in Shag Harbor UFO, RCAF." In such, I have an interview clip from the reporter who wrote the piece.
The RCMP were telling us that their people had seen it. Various people in the boats had gone out, and I was on the phone getting everyone I could to talk to me, and gradually started piecing together what had been seen that night. A contact I had in the armed forces gave me a number to call in Ottawa for a squadron leader, Bain, who tells me that he was heading a Canadian Armed Forces unit that basically investigated and cataloged UFOs, almost like the American Project Blue Book, which I had never heard of and didn't know existed. He said, yeah, this sounds like an incident that may have something concrete in it, which they made into a headline for the paper. In my judgment, it became a headline story because we had RCMP officers who not only saw it, but were making public statements that they saw it.
This is why this story is one of a kind. There's no single critic. Everyone from civilians to military personnel all agree that whatever that wasn't earthly. By now, the military was getting involved, and this time, more than 3 different countries were involved. I could be wrong about the total number of involved countries, but I know for a fact that the Canadian military, the American military, and the Russian military were also involved. So, one thing that wasn't clear at that time was that where the UFO crashed into, or dove into, was close to a military base. And to be specific, it was near a secret submarine detection base. The Canadian Forces Base Shelburne was a joint Canadian-American secret military base that was operational during the Cold War. Initially, there was a cover story that was used to defend why the base existed. The cover story was that the base was being used for an oceanographic study to study wave action, water depth, and salinity, and other things to help the navies of both countries learn more about the ocean. It wasn't until the 1980s that it became known for what it really was: a secret submarine detection base detecting all submarines all over the North Atlantic. The operation was part of the SUSAS system, which is basically an underwater network of microphones deployed throughout the North Atlantic that was very successful in detecting and tracking the noisy diesel and then nuclear Soviet submarines of the Cold War. The signals were channeled ashore to CFS Shelburne at Government Point, where they were monitored 24 hours a day. In addition to that, they had another grid laid out under the water, which was called the MAD grid, or Magnetic Anomaly Detection Grid, which could detect the halt signatures of heavy metal vessels, submarines in particular, and they could pinpoint them on a grid as to where these particular vessels were when they were picked up. You have to understand that Shelburne is part of a system for monitoring the Atlantic Ocean for the Soviet fleet, but more importantly, for Soviet submarines, and so you're always concerned about anybody and anything coming within view of your sensing systems, and you want to know how vulnerable you are because maybe this is something before an attack, and the first thing you do is knock out the other guy's detection system. But here's another thing most of us didn't know. There were actually 2 different UFOs on 2 different days. The first UFO plane crashed, and a sonar actually picked up the object, and naval ships were even put in place to watch it. After a few days, the military was making plans for a salvage operation to take the UFO and definitely investigate, when a second UFO joined the first one. This is why most people who are invested in this story think that the second ship had come to help the first one. At first, the military thought it was a Russian submarine, which is why I said a lot of countries were involved in this operation. Heck, there was actually a Russian submarine nearby. And this was during the apex period of the Cold War, so everyone was alert. But we can confirm now that the crashed plane had nothing to do with Russia. Because of the secret base being joined with the United States, it was also believed that the US was involved in a follow-up investigation, but the US has never admitted or even said anything public about the event. Shocker. When I was researching this story, it started to kind of make sense that this could be a UFO. Personally, one thing I find strange is that most UFO sightings, especially the ones that seem random without abduction cases, tend to be around military bases, and the crazy thing is, they show on bases that are so secret that even people living close to it didn't know. But somehow, the UFOs always knew that this was a secret military base, usually studying nuclear energy, and then, according to some reports, even went as far as sabotaging the entire thing to prevent Hiroshima from ever happening again. Japan wasn't the only country terrified. All living things were terrified. In such, I had to look it up online to be certain I wasn't just spitballing, and it turns out that I was onto something. Using publicly available data from the National UFO Reporting Center, researchers from the RAND Corporation found that there was a consistent correlation between areas of military operations and public reports of UAP sightings. So this makes me wonder, was there a secret program that was going on in a secret base that even people working there didn't know, which drew the attention of this extraterrestrial? Could there be? Unfortunately, that question was never answered, because just as quickly as the news became viral, the news quickly died out, and no one talked about the Shag Harbor UFO incident for a long time, 26 years to be precise, until 1993. You know how they say one incident can change your view about everything? For Isaac Newton, it was the apple falling on his head from a tree. For Archimedes, it was as simple as taking a bath. And for the 12-year-old Chris Stiles, it was this UFO event. In the town of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, on the night of October 4th, 1967, a young boy named Chris Stiles was looking out his bedroom window when he saw something that would stay with him forever and change his life. He saw the orange lights, and then he saw the UFO plane coming down from above. This event changed Chris's life, and he became dedicated to studying UFO encounters. In fact, Chris joined the Mutual UFO Network, also known as MUFON, a non-profit group based in Cincinnati, when he was older. MUFON has done a lot of research into UFOs since it was founded in 1969. Chris and another MUFON member, Don Ledger, talked to as many UFO witnesses as they could find in Shag Harbor in 1993. They interviewed divers, military officials, police officers, and anyone they could find. A lot of the names they knew came from reading old newspaper articles. The statements from these eyewitnesses that Chris and Don gathered helped them piece together an explanation as well as a compelling book. Their 1993 book, Dark Object, the world's only government-documented UFO crash, provided a hypothesis that goes like this. That fateful night, a UFO from space crashed in Shag Harbor. It then traveled underwater to a camp in Nova Scotia called Government Point, which is about 25 miles away from Ground Zero. Finally, the UFO came to a stop near the CFS Shelburne, which was a secret military base at the time. As said before, on paper, the CFS Shelburne was supposed to be conducting ocean research, but in reality, their real job was to keep an eye on Cold War submarines. In any case, this UFO was seen by people at the CFS Shelburne. A group of military ships from the Canadian Forces were sent to wait in the water above this UFO object until it could be salvaged. The story gets really strange when, within a few days, another mysterious craft shows up close to the first one. Chris and Don thought that the same aliens sent this second UFO from space as the first one, and that the second craft was meant to help the first one who was in trouble. The book says that the Canadian Forces kept an eye on both USOs for a few more days. Then, the attention of the military went towards a Russian submarine that was heading toward them. Like as if the UFO knew that the attention was no longer on them, they made their move immediately. Out of nowhere, the two unexplained objects sped off toward the Gulf of Maine, jumped out of the water, and shot up into the air, going back to where they came from.
Said, I don't know if what's responsible here is extraterrestrial, extratemporal, or extra-dimensional, but it was certainly unconventional. And I think they ran with that premise in Ottawa, and I think that the priority and the tone of these documents speaks loudly that they were dealing with something potentially extraterrestrial.
This book and this story were what made the Shag Harbor story gain a new life in 1993 after 26 years of being forgotten, and it came into people's consciousness. Now that we've heard the stories and theories, what do the critics have to say about this? Let's start with the man who brought this to our consciousness in the first place, Chris Stiles. Despite how quite detailed the book is, there's no proof per se to back up the claims other than anonymous eyewitness accounts. The people who were interviewed for the book supposedly didn't want to be named because they were afraid of being shamed or, in the case of veterans, losing their pensions. But here's what I don't get. Anyone from Shag Harbor will be willing to tell you the story. It's like a heritage from there. I'm sorry if this sounds mean, but Shag Harbor is quite a boring village, and there's nothing memorable about it aside from its name, which is a dirty joke for those from the United Kingdom. So this UFO was what put Shag Harbor on the map. In such, I didn't even know this city existed until I did my research into the story. The point I'm trying to make is that people were willing to talk about it so much that they have a museum that is about the event that happened that night. The Royal Canadian Mint even made a Shag Harbor UFO coin at one point. So the claim that people are not willing to talk is kind of suspicious to me. Luckily, that's not enough to discredit the book or the event, because there are multiple witnesses to this event. Another logical reason or criticism is that it could have been a meteor or flashing lights. Basically, what they called a UFO could be something explainable and mundane falling from space. Meteors do have a yellowish color, and they fly very fast and silently across the sky, leaving a glowing trail behind them, as told in the story. In such, in 2016, there was actually a meteor that fell in Australia, and people thought it was a UFO at first. So yeah, it's very possible this isn't extraterrestrial. But here's the thing, it wasn't a meteor that fell. You know why? If it was, the government would gladly tell us, and there would be signs of impact, and people would have seen it even before those weird pesky government agencies got involved. In such, the agencies involved did say this was no meteor or flare, or anything man-made. So this was no meteor, and even though Chris Stiles' story is from an anonymous witness, that doesn't take the fact that a lot of people did see it and are talking about it. In such, this case was kind of weird because no one was threatened, and everyone talked freely as they could. Maybe it's because it's Canada, a place that's joked about for how nice they are. So maybe that's why. Either way, I am inclined to believe that something did crash. What we don't know is if the government got their hands on it and experimented on it, or if it escaped as said. Still, what really happened in Shag Harbor on October 4th, 1967, will forever remain a mystery.